All right. All right, so as I mentioned, again, we're going to start talking about human development, and we're going to include conversations about emotions and how emotions play a role in our psychological world. That's not an area we really had focused on in our last conversations, so we will be spending a little bit of time talking about that as well. So let's start with, what is human development? Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really about the study of how people change over time. Now, because of historical reasons, most of developmental psychology focuses on the age of 0 to 18. Because there was this misunderstanding that when we hit the age of 18, we're done developing our personality, intelligence, cognitive levels, emotional levels are set, and we don't change after that. This was unfortunately set by one of the very first developmental theories that we're going to look at, which is Sigmund Freud's theory, who believed that between adolescence to 18 is the last developmental phase, and then after that, we're done. And we're going to see, unfortunately, other theories followed that suit. But there is some good news, I think, that we should talk about, is at least over the last 30 years. It has been going on longer than that, but really focusing in the last 30, 40 years, there's been a focus also on adult development and development changes for adults. And I think this is good news in a lot of ways, is that it's important to note that we just don't stop growing after 18, that there's a lot of changes emotionally, psychologically, biologically that we have to look forward to. There are some things that we have to pay attention to as we age, such as things like cognitive decline and stuff. But as we will learn from what we've learned about adult development, there are ways that we can lessen those cognitive declines and those physical declines as we move forward. But we will see that there is a lot of cool stuff that happens after the age of 18. One of the main reasons is that, that we pay a lot more attention to adult development now, is that over about the last 120 years, our lifespan has doubled for some pretty significant reasons. One is the Industrial Revolution, which made it so that our work days became shorter, and we spent less time on things such as labor, and we were able to focus on leisure. But also probably the number one reason is our advent of medicines and medical treatments for different disorders that would cut our life short, such as polio and diseases like that. So literally because of medical advances and because of changes in lifestyle, over the last 120 years, our lifespan has doubled. Okay, before about 1850, the average lifespan would be between the age of 36 to 40. Most of that reason would be because most individuals were dying in childhood or at childbirth. But then as we see, as they got into their 20s and 30s, there were different other disorders that attacked them as adults, okay? And some have argued, wrong two in this slide, some have argued that over this last 120 years that because of this, we actually live two lifestyles. So that should say we live two lives, not TOTWO. The first one from 0 to 40, and then the second one from 40 to the end of life. And one of the main arguments behind this is that we're starting to see that between the age of 35 and 45, people are making major life changes. This is where we see the highest divorce rates. This is where we see people going back to higher education to seek a different occupation. This is where we see high rates of turnover in the job place. This is where we see a lot of people making significant life changes. And we'll look at this argument more and more when we get to this age group. But this is kind of where that is at, is that a lot of people are seeing this period, this 10-year period, where people go through major changes almost as if they're almost being reborn again. But we'll look at some other reasons this is as well, okay? We should look at, just for a minute, I don't know if it's on here, some cohort issues that we see going on within the realm of development. When we're talking about cohort, we're not talking about what happens during normal development, but what happens based on a period of time when people are born, okay? And we'll start with this age group starting from about 35 to 55, okay? Traditionally, individuals between the age of 30 to 60, considering midlife and average life, have been truly the backbone of a society. This is when individuals are raising families, buying homes, producing the majority of commodities and goods and services we see within a country. This is when people are being civic interaction, getting involved with local government, nonprofits, those kinds of things. Traditionally, that's what we've seen. But again, over the last we got to extend this to about the last 60 years, we're seeing a shift within this population to where we're seeing the most dysfunction among this group. And what I mean by that is it seems that within our time, this age group have the highest divorce rates. They have the highest changes in job. On average, a person changes a job every 7 to 10 years. In this age group, they're changing jobs every 2 to 3 years. We see the highest rates of medication use, such as antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. And we're seeing the highest rates of things like alcohol abuse among this group. And so for some reason in our social world, there has been some adjustments to this. And one of the things that I want us to do is our discussion post for this week, which I'll post after this class, is I want you to hypothesize about why you think it is that middle age has gone from being the backbone of the group, the one that's holding things together, to where we're seeing some of the highest rates of dysfunction within this age group. So your discussion post will be about middle adulthood and why we're seeing so much dysfunction. Now, with that being said, for us who are in this age group, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to experience this. And if you're in a younger age group, it doesn't mean that that's what you have to look forward to. It's just in this certain amount of time, this is where we're seeing the highest rates of these social issues, okay? So it's not that you have to look forward to this as you enter into a middle adulthood. And it's not, if you're in middle adulthood, this is life for you. These are just trends. And I want you to speak to the trends that we're seeing socially, okay? So that'll be a discussion post that I'd like you to have for this week. The other issue that we're seeing on a cohort level deals with when people become physically maturated versus psychologically maturated, okay? And when we talk about this, what we mean is the time period when a person goes through puberty, where a person gets their adult human qualities and secondary adult qualities, and their body grows to the adult level of growth, okay? Psychological maturity is a little bit more difficult to explain, but we can do it with this analogy, okay? Psychological maturity versus non-psychological maturity. And the best analogy to make is if, let's say you're at the mall or at your favorite store, clothing store, and you have $50 in your wallet. And there's a shirt that is on sale for $50. But you don't get paid until next Friday. And on Monday, your power bill is due and it's $50. Okay. The psychologically mature mind would put the shirt back on the hanger and think forward and go ahead and pay their power bill. The psychologically immature mind will buy the shirt and hope they can deal with the power bill at a later date and time. So it's not only the ability to plan ahead in the future, but it's also about the ability to delay psychological and emotional gratification here in the moment. So that's psychological maturation, if you want to put it in those terms. Okay. Other ways it has been defined is at what point a person is able to live and survive on their own without any type of parental support. Okay, that's another social definition of psychological maturation. Okay, so let's look at the changes we've seen in the cohorts that we've studied so far. Okay, and these, so if you were to have taken this class in the 1990s, we would have said puberty is around the age of 12 and psychological maturation is around the age of 18, okay? In the early 2000s, we would have went to 11 for puberty and we would have went to 21 for psychological maturation. Currently, we're under the age of 11 for the majority of puberty, and the average age for psychological maturation in the United States is 27. So literally in the span of what, 20, 30 years, the age of puberty is getting younger and younger, and the age of psychological maturation is getting older and older, okay? Now, there's some things that we should note. When I talk about puberty as getting younger and younger, there has been young girls going through puberty at the age of 4. The youngest sexual abuse victim that I worked with that got pregnant from her abuser, she got pregnant at the age of 8 and gave birth at the age of 9. And so when I say we're getting younger and younger and younger, the deviation for you going through puberty is getting younger and younger. And right now, I believe the youngest person that we're aware of was 4 years old, okay? When we talk about psychological maturation, we can note that there's some differences, okay? And it can be put on gender lines. We're recognizing that that on average, women are going through psychological maturation at the age of 21, and men are going through psychological maturation at around the age of 34 on average. I think we have a lot of above average people in this class, so don't think this category counts everyone, okay? So what do we find when we're measuring this? We find that on average, women are able to pay their own rent, get their own vehicle, hold their own jobs at the age of 21, independent of parents. Men on average is the average age of about 34 when they're able to do the same things without any type of family support, okay? And so the average age, once you control for gender, is 27, and that's where we get that number of 27, okay? And so here we have psychological maturation and physical maturation getting a larger spread between each of them, okay? So the second discussion post, which won't be due this week, but will be due next week, is I want you to hypothesize. Again, there's no right or wrong answer, but why you think these spreads between physically maturating and psychologically maturating are getting wider and wider. I'll post some articles on this one to help you look at it in both ways. I'll post articles for both so that you can take a look at those. But those are the kind of cohort issues that I would like you to tackle as a class. And I'll put more explanation in the discussion post. So the discussion post for this week will be the middle adulthood, why we're seeing so much dysfunction. And then for next week, it will be about physical and psychological maturation. And that's how we'll handle our discussion posts as far as participation points are concerned, okay? Does anybody have any questions about where we're headed with that right at the moment? Thank you, Amelia. Okay. All right. Okay. Darnay, I'll email you about that because I'm not sure why that happened. I need to check with IT. So I'll discuss that with you through the Halo messaging so that we can make sure you can earn those points. Okay, thank you for letting me know that again. Appreciate it. Okay. All right, so those are issues we're seeing with cohort. We've discussed the lifespan expanding, and this is why we're getting more and more interested in adult development. And we've seen some cohort issues with middle age, and we're seeing some cohort issues with adolescence and young adulthood. So let's go ahead and get right into a general discussion about what we see as human development. So these issues are not necessarily because you were born between 1990 and 2003 or something like that. These are questions that we ask about what is the consistent trajectory of people at a certain age, okay? And we look at development within 3 domains. The first one is the biological processes, okay? Biological processes. Biological processes are those processes dealing with our physical development. How do we change physically over time? Okay, and I think we've discussed this a little bit in the past, you know, dealing with early childhood, that human beings are born with an underdeveloped brain. And so instead of fully developing in mom's biological womb, we develop in our social cultural setting of the exterior world for a large part, okay? And so we'll look at early childhood really closely because there's some significant things that are happening to us that if we were another species would have been happening in mom's stomach, okay? But when we talk about biological processes, we'll go on and talk about that development of the brain. And then we'll go on and talk about the development that we experience through puberty and early adulthood. We'll look at changes and clear through the lifespan as we look at what happens physically when we start to age, okay? And just as I suggested in the early childhood domain, is that this biological processes influences also our socio-emotional processes and our cognitive processes, okay, because of where our brains are in the developmental process, okay? When we talk about socio-emotional processes, we're talking about our interaction with our social and cultural world and how that influences us and we influence it, okay? You'll note that socio-emotional are put together because when we talk about the concept of emotions, we'll realize emotions have an external purpose and they have an internal purpose. The external purpose is to signal to other people that we are either feeling safe or we're feeling like something's wrong, okay? Internal purposes are those things that we experience physiologically that tell us things are going good or things are going bad, okay? So it has to do with our social interactions, and we're going to learn that a lot of our emotions are so tied to language that sometimes we can misinterpret emotions based on the definitions that are provided for those emotions given to us by our social world. And we'll talk about that as we go through the developmental phases through childhood into adulthood. We also know that, again, our socio-emotional development affects our biological development, okay? We can see that children who experience, for example, trauma from their external world, and if that trauma is significant enough and chronic enough, it can stunt the development of the brain. It can basically put a freeze on the brain saying, don't develop anymore, okay? We also know that it affects our cognitive world, okay? I just read a recent article where the family system and how supportive the family system is actually predicts your cognitive abilities in adolescence. Cognitive abilities being those abilities to think, to problem solving, intelligence, those types of processes, of internal processes. So something to think about. The way we're treated by our family influences this process here. And so when we do talk about cognitive processes, we are talking about our ability to problem solve, to adaptively respond to our environment, to think about our future, reflect on our past, all of those thought processes and decision-making processes we go through. And again, we know that cognitive processes also influence our socio-emotional processes. If we talk about things like depression, we know that rumination thoughts and negative thoughts play a large role in the experience of the emotional or the mood disorder of depression and anxiety, and vice versa. And we will see that our cognitive process, I should probably put this arrow here since I already mentioned it, huh? Our cognitive processes, once again, can influence our biological processes. We will definitely be talking about this when we get into older adulthood. And we look at when we start talking about biologically decline, we will see that the more active that the person stays in their engagement with the world, such as reading, learning things, this whole concept of becoming a lifelong learner, has a direct effect on our biological decline, okay? And so we're gonna see how these all interact as we move along through our journey of understanding growth and development. Okay. When we're talking about biological processes, these are just some things that we want to answer as we move along, okay? One of the questions we ask when we're looking at the biological processes is how much does nature, meaning life experience, no, nature, sorry, I got that backwards. Nature, meaning our genetics, our inheritance, influence our development versus nurture, which is life experience, okay? And what we're going to see as that last slide denoted, it's an interaction between the two, but we do want to know how much one contributes and how much does the other, okay? When we talk about genotype versus phenotype, we want to know what parts of our genetic code are fixed and are in place, meaning, you know, things like our eye color, our hair color, you know, our body size, all of those things, versus those things that are not so fixed. So things like intelligence and thought processes and emotional processes both have to deal with genetics, but one's a genotype, meaning fixed, and phenotype, meaning more flexible. And then we want to know, what can we do in life to have the most optimal physical and psychological well-being? So what is it that we need to make sure we're doing with our body to make sure that we can perform at our best? Okay, so those are kind of the processes that we'll look at when we're talking about biological processes. All right, so let's move on. Now that we have had an introduction to these processes, let's move on and talk about the three kind of main theories that we should focus on. Again, one is going to be a biologically focused theory. The next one is going to be cognitive, and the last one is going to be socio-emotional. The one that we're going to start with is one by a man named Sigmund Freud, who, if you remember at the beginning of the course, was the individual that gave us our theory of the unconscious mind and the like, and how our unconscious mind is driven by two basic instincts, one being eros, the other thanatos, which he's going to reduce to sex and aggression, okay? The reason why we're going to start with Sigmund Freud is he introduced a very important theoretical approach to developmental psychology. In that he theorized that development occurs in stages. And dependent upon how successful we were in one stage, will determine or help us in the next level or the next stage of development we're in. And he's going to argue that how we experience each of those developmental stages will determine different abilities as we become adults and we become older, okay? So his introduction of stage theory had a huge influence on developmental theory. Indeed, the next two theories on cognitive and social-emotional development are also stage theories. The other reason we're going to start with Freud is he introduced the idea of biologically driven instincts, okay? Freud was hugely influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution that states that people and species and plants and animals, we evolve over time to meet the demands of environmental contingencies. Okay. And what he's going to largely argue is that human beings are driven by our biologically evolutionary propensities. Okay. For him, what we have carried with our ancestors is this unconscious need to create and destroy. Okay. Which he's going to reduce to sex and aggression, okay, that we're either wanting to reproduce or we're wanting to be aggressive towards others and promote the kind of what thanatos, the death instinct, okay? Now, what he's going to argue is that these are largely unconscious desires, that most of what drives behavior does not happen on a cognitive conscious level, but by these biologically driven instincts that are largely unconscious to us, okay? And that, and this is going to set, remember in the beginning of the week, we kind of went over this, where those two drives exist are within the id, or what would be translated as the it, most closely in English, and that the other structures of the mind include the ego, which the ego has access to our conscious world and has access to what the needs or the drives of the id are. And the ego's job is to make a decision on what's most appropriate for us to react in our external world to also meet those internal drives towards creation or death, okay? And then later on, he added the concept of the superego, which he defined as the moral area of the brain. But as I think I warned when we were going over this shortly at the beginning of the semester, remember, for Freud, moral wasn't necessarily doing the right thing. It was doing the perfect thing. It was a head towards perfect human abilities, okay, in any social situation. So it had nothing to do with happiness, with finding joy, and that's commonly what we think about when we're acting moral, is we want to bring up our worth and desires in the world, okay? I just want to make that clear. So this is kind of his model of the unconscious or conscious world based on these basic, and he argued that these are basic biological drives. When we do look at the brain and the brain system, as mentioned in the biological reasons, are these our only drives? Absolutely not. But they are two very basic drives that humans have, and we share these with other species as well, is the drive towards procreation and the drive towards, we all ultimately are going to die. We all ultimately have to compete aggressively for the resources to survive. And so we also have a biological drive towards aggression to protect those things that we hold valuable, okay? And a lot of times these unconscious drives are not driven by conscious decisions. So we have to give that some type of credence. When we look at genetic propensities and all those kinds of things, they weren't necessarily things that people chose to have, okay? All right. So after Freud developed this theory, he thought in his clinical practice, he really saw that the most of adult problems in his idea can be traced back to early childhood, into the most very basic concepts of the relationship between especially the child and the mother. And if you've ever, and it brings up one of the stereotypes of therapy, is most people think about, oh, they're going to make me talk about my childhood and my relationship with mom and all those kinds of things and find some trauma that occurred in childhood. I will tell you that that is a stereotype. It's not actually one of the more effective types of treatments for psychological disorders, but it is definitely still a stereotype we have of treatment and therapy. But the credence to early childhood and the developmental stages still holds that there are things that occur in childhood that do have either direct or indirect impacts on us as adults. And we'll kind of go over those as we move forward. So now, one of the unfortunate consequences of Freud's first developing a theory and then developing a developmental theory is that he really didn't actually want to make a theory based purely on sex. But because his theory was so ingrained in human sexuality and in human aggression, if he were to kind of explain his developmental ideas without those, there would be a disconnect between his theory and his developmental theory. And so this can sound very strange as we go through this, but I will stop and try and explain maybe what Freud was trying to get to as we move through his psychosexual stages of development. So what Freud believed based upon his theory is development occurs where the person receives the most sensations, where they receive the most needs at a certain time or period within their development, okay? And so his first stage of development, where a child really receives sensation satisfaction, is through the intake of breast milk and of formula, we could put that term, through the sucking reflex, okay? And so he considered 0 to 2 what he called the oral phase of development, because this was the area of the body that the infant uses the most. And if we look at infants, and if I've been around infants, they do like putting everything in their mouth, okay? And what Freud believed is that the whole goal of being successful in these stages of development is that you overcome this need for this sensation seeking of this area of the body, that you take control over it, and that you have control over this different area, okay? So what did Freud believe? If we weren't able to control our sucking reflex, our need to put things in our mouth, what did he believe would happen to the individual? Well, he believed that the infant became orally fixated, okay? Meaning that they couldn't consume enough, all right? He himself believed he was orally fixated, in that he started smoking cigars, I believe, around the age of 12. And he said he could not go a day without having a cigar. And he actually died of mouth cancer, of jaw cancer, because of his cigar smoking. And that's what Freud died from. So he believed that this explained some things, and this is where we can get into some cultural myths about his theory. One, he believed that this explains things like obesity, okay? Because people who are obese, he believed, can't stop consuming food, all right? He believed this explained things like alcohol addiction, smoking addiction, because a person couldn't get enough satisfaction from consumption, okay? I think this is one of his unfortunate parts of his theory, because there is still a lot of dietitians, medical doctors, medical professionals, even psychologists. We have a whole entire health industry that focuses on consumption of food as part of weight loss and weight gain. And yes, it does. There are things like emotional eating, all those kinds of things. But what we know scientifically about obesity is it has less to do with the amount of food someone consumes and more to do with metabolism of a metabolic system. And I always think about me and my brother. I'm a big guy. My brother is very skinny. If we went to McDonald's together, he could consume 5 Big Macs, and he's still hungry, and he's still small. I can consume 1 and I could gain 20 pounds. That's an exaggeration, but the point being that it was really, if you believe that obesity and everything is being caused by overconsumption, this is a Freudian idea. It actually doesn't hold very well scientifically. We also know types of food people eat, not how much they eat, play a role as well. So there is that as well. So anyways, but going on with the oral fixation idea, this is where he believed that consumption goes back to this age. And if we successfully get through the oral phase, we're able to control our consumption needs and control our ingestion needs, okay? So that's mark number 1. Gave us a good social myth, but there might not be too much to the idea of consumption based on the need to stop sucking, okay? The second phase that he believed that individuals go through is the anal phase. Now, the anal phase, if we really look at individual success, I always think it's interesting that we start with things like high school, and we celebrate high school graduation. I think now they celebrate first grade graduation too. I think I even saw a kindergarten graduation, but academic or something like that. One of the things that I really think that we deserve a diploma for, though, and the first one maybe we should have, is potty training. Now, I know not everybody thinks about this, about what the significance of potty training is, but I want you to think about it in this context. When we potty train, we're doing two very significant things. The first thing is that we're actually giving into the demands of a social authority. Mom and dad saying you can't urinate or defecate in your diaper anymore. I hope they don't use that terms, but that's kind of the idea. You need to stop doing that behavior. And we're going to make a decision to stop doing that behavior. So it's one of the very first times that we're really giving into a social demand. We're making the decision to give into a social demand. The other significant part of this is it's one of the very first times that we're taking control of our physiological and biological processes. So instead of just defecating or urinating when we get the urge, we are making a choice that when we get the urge, we're going to wait till the right time and the right place to relieve that urge. Okay. So not only are we giving into the demands of our social world and social authority, we're also taking control of the first time of some of our biological processes. So it's a significant thing that, that we're going through. What Freud believed is this ability to take control really determined how much self-control a person can have internally, and how they will relate between their control of their inner world with their outer world, okay? So a person who, for example, becomes what we would call anally fixated is an individual who wasn't able to take complete control of their internal world, and therefore not to have control over the demands of the external world. So what they do is, instead of because they can't take control of their internal world, they take excessive control of their external world, okay? This is where we get the social term, you are anal, or someone is being anal. Because someone who, according to Freud, who is anally fixated is someone who takes excessive control of their external world. So it's the person who comes in the room and everything needs to be perfectly laid out. It has to be done their way or no way. And they don't take good criticism, those types of things. Okay. So that's what Freud believed occurred at this developmental stage. All right. Is there any questions about these two first stages? All right, thank you. Now, I am going to just to state again, a criticism of this phase is there is no scientific evidence that there is an association between when a child potty trains, if a child potty trains, and being anal or needing over control over one person's environment. Again, we use more anal in non-Freudian terms these days, but I just want to make sure everyone knows that. Again, this is another mark against Freud, is just like the oral phase, it did just create a social word that we use to describe a certain type of person. But there's really no evidence about when a child potty trains and their future success. So I just want to bring that up as a criticism to this theory. The next phase that Freud believed we went through is what he called the phallic phase. And this occurs between the age of 4 and 6. And this is where we need to have a kind of an open discussion about things like childhood masturbation. Okay. There is evidence that children masturbate in the womb while they're developing mom's womb and well into and through their childhood. But we need to distinguish the difference between adult and child. Okay, children stimulate themselves because there's a whole bunch of nerve cells in certain areas of their body that when touched, it feels really good. Okay, and we need to give credit to that there's no perversion to it. It's just when they touch certain parts of their body, it feels good. When we talk about adults, however, it's the stimulation of those areas while fantasizing or having fantasies about another person. Okay, so here is some good parent advice when you walk in on your child and they're stimulating areas of their body. Have an open conversation. You don't sit and shame them or anything else, because you can get some very useful information. If when you ask, hey, why are you touching yourself there? And they say, because it feels good, that's a good thing. If they say something like, well, I'm thinking about so-and-so and it feels good when I touch there and I think about that person, or Uncle Joe showed me and it makes me feel good, and that's the reason why I touch, then you have a problem, okay? One is just a normal experience of physical sensation. The other one is that you have a child that you need to make sure you get checked and evaluated for. So just some make sure you make those differentiations as you evaluate when you do this as a parent, okay? So on Freud's end, he believed that if a child doesn't overcome this stimulation, then they become sensation seekers. These are people who are willing to get into high-risk situations, who are willing to take stimulations or stimulant drugs in order to have that feeling of exhilaration. And so he feels like, he theorized that it's in this stage where a person becomes either a thrill taker or is able to control thrill seeking and high-risk situations, okay? So that's one thing about the phallic stage that Freud believed of if they got fixated there or not, okay? Now, Freud did get a little weird in this phase, and I want to explain this very clearly. Is he believed that boys go through what's called the Deputist Complex, and later on Carl Jung, who is a predecessor of Freud, gave the girls a complex called the electric complex. But if anyone remembers from your philosophy or Greek history classes about the story of Oedipus, he was born with this, this myth that he was at risk of killing his father and marrying his mom and having relationships with his mom. So based on this, his biological parents, when he was born, sent him away, but Oedipus didn't know he was being adopted or taken care of by different parents. And so in later life, when he learned about this myth, he didn't want to have relationships with what he thought was his current mom, and he didn't want to kill his father. So he moved back, but he ended up in the village where his biological parents lived. And as the myth goes, he did end up killing his actual biological father and having relationships with his actual biological mother. But we should say that in Freudian terms, I think this is a very poor example. Oedipus actually did everything he could to avoid this myth coming true. So I don't know if he was the best example of what Freud was meant by the Oedipus complex, because he definitely was not trying to have relationships with who he thought was his actual mother. But what Freud believed and what this complex is that as a young boy is developing, he desires or he wants relationships with the one and only love object, his first love, which is his mother. And he recognizes that the barrier to that love is his father. So what he does is he starts to mimic and take on the quality of his father in order to gain relationship or favor with the mother. Okay. Now, later on, after Freud, Carl Jung added the Electra complex, which was kind of in the reverse, where the girl wants relationships with the father. There's a lot more detail in this one. According to Jung, it has more to do with the father's private parts, but we don't need to get into that. But she does the same thing as the boy, is that she starts to mimic the qualities of the mother to try and gain favor of the father. Okay. Now, let's step back for a minute, because this is where a lot of people get very freaked out about this theory, because no one wants to think that they would want to have relationships with their mother or relationships with their father of a sexual nature. But let me kind of illuminate probably what Freud was trying to get to about this stage of development. All right. We do know that this stage of development, there's a very important thing that children do, and it's very, very important to their development, is they do a certain type of play. In fact, we're finding children do this at a younger age, usually starting, around the age of 2 or 3. And that is something called role playing. This is where little boys and girls and children all in any area start to play out roles in the world. So this is where you play Superman, firefighter, mom, dad, doctor, patient, and you take on all of these roles and you role play them in the form of play. Okay. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to decide which work for you and which don't, which is more like you, which is more not like you. And one of the important areas that we role play, and we do it in our mind and through interactions, is we tended to play things like house. We tried to take on the role of mom and the role of dad. And we found that in the absence of this ability to role play those roles, there's dysfunction that can be created in later life as far as human relationships and those types of things, okay? And an example of this comes out of research of adults who were raised by single parents. And now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of amazing people who were raised by amazing single parents. So this is not a criticism of all single parents, all right? This is a subset of single parents that I want to illuminate what we're trying to get at with this phase of development, okay? Is we have cohorts who have been raised by single parents, and we can compare to a couple groups, okay? We can compare mothers who raised young boys in the absence of any male role models, whether it be a boyfriend, a stepfather, a grandfather, those types of things. We can also take individuals who were fathers who raised their daughters in the absence of any female role models. So, you know, aunts, grandmothers, girlfriends, stepmoms, those types of things, okay? And when we look at individuals that were raised in that situations, and we compare them to single parents who did expose children to the opposite sex role models of them, and we compare later in life in relationships and those types of things, we find that those individuals in those first two categories have difficulties in relationship satisfaction, relationship communication, dating, and the ability to have good conversations and healthy relationships with the opposite sex. Because what we think happened is in this early developmental phase, because those things were not being role modeled, they couldn't be role played in the child's play world. And so because that opportunity wasn't there, that opportunity to develop those skills did not occur. I think that's a better explanation of what Freud was trying to get at than what came out in his theory. And we can actually see it in current research, okay? The next stage of development, according to Freud, was a latent period of development, which I think for child development research is very unfortunate, because he's going to designate 6 to puberty to a latent period. There's nothing really significantly developmentally going on, that basically we're just learning the skills of how to live life. So writing, math, chores, those kinds of things, but nothing significantly psychologically is occurring during this developmental period. And as we will see in other theories and in research, this area, unfortunately, because of this, has really been largely ignored. That a lot of the research that we have on 6 to puberty really rely on research that has been done in schools and those kinds of things. But there's a large lacking understanding of really what happens during this period, because this theory laid that out, okay? And then his last phase of development, which is known as a genital phase, happened from puberty to the age of 18. Because remember, he's one of the first to say 18 is where it ends. And this is where we get the notion of mature sexuality, where we learn how to have appropriate relationships with other individuals, okay? And again, if we fell at this stage, we end up, if you want to put it this way, and in his clinical practice, he found that this is the age where a lot of sex offenders and a lot of sex victims are really propagated by society and by a person's developmental phase. So that's where his notion of appropriate sexuality and inappropriate sexuality comes from. Okay, that's the end of Freud. And I'm going to give some criticisms. Is our childhood just based on this one notion? No. Were there some social ideas that came out of it? We can see that in these first 2 phases. Is there parts of his theory that because they were very strange, but were they trying to get at something, maybe something real that had nothing to do with his sexuality model? Yes. Are there some things missing in our literature on development because of the theory? Yes. And should we be looking at this area? We will when we get to adolescence and we start talking about this. But even this maturity level has a lot to do with what happened in early childhood. It doesn't necessarily just come out in this stage, okay? So I'm just gonna ask again, does anybody have any questions about Freud's theory? Because we can move on. Good, okay. All right. So again, Freud's theory was biologically based. And there is some notion that we can say that biology does run part of our cognitive and our social world. And yes, human sexuality is a significant part of that, but it probably doesn't explain everything about our development. There's other aspects of our world that we should look at, okay? And when we get to young adulthood, when we start talking about romantic relationships, we will see that that we have two systems within our brain. One is the sexual system. The other one is the intimate relationship system. And I'm just going to say this from a neurological perspective. Those are two separate systems. In the brain, they do not interact with each other. But in our social cultural world, we do interact the two and think that they're one and the same. But as we will learn, that can often lead to difficulties. But that's where we'll leave that topic for right now. I just want to introduce, because we've gone really strong and we've talked a lot about stuff today. I just want to introduce what we're going to talk about this coming Thursday. Yeah, it's Tuesday. All right. We're going to now talk about one of our first cognitive theories. And again, cognitive is how we mentally construct our world, how we think about it, decision-making, and all of those types of things. And the person that we'll be talking about is Jean Piaget, who was actually an epistemologist. He was actually originally interested in how ducklings and geese imprint on parents when they're born. Very interesting man, and he wanted to know, does imprinting occur with humans? And he quickly came to understand that humans are a lot more complex than ducklings and geese when they're born, and they become attached to an external world and their understanding of the external world. Okay. And what he's going to argue is that individuals evolve cognitively in different stages of development based upon the skills and the availability of the individual during this certain period of development. And he's going to bring up some important concepts. I just want to make sure, see if this is in there. The word that is missing on this slide is the word schema, spelled S-C-H-E-M-A. And what a schema is it's our basic representation of any given object or thing. So it's the most basic qualities we need to identify that a poodle and a Saint Bernard are dogs. Even though they look a lot different, we still put them in the same category as dog. Okay. And so a schema is the most basic structure of a representation of an object or thing. Now, the reason why I want everybody to understand this at this point is later on when we get into social psychology and we talk about things like social cognition and those types of things, and social categorization, we're going to bring up this idea of schemas again, because schemas become the basis of stereotypes we have for outgroups and our representation of our in-group. It is the basis of how we represent things cognitively that drive things like prejudiced thoughts, biased thoughts towards other groups and other things. So the understanding of a schema as a basic unit of knowledge or understanding of what a category is what I want to get across right at this moment, okay? And how do we create these schemas? Well, Piaget believed we did this through what's called assimilation versus accommodation, okay? Assimilation is the initial development of a category. So it's those things that we represent as a dog. So let's, take a poodle. Their legs, they bark, their ear structures, their body structures, their tails, their behaviors become that basic structure. But then comes in the picture a Saint Bernard, which is much larger, has a deeper bark, but it has some very similar behaviors to a poodle. Maybe I'm using bad examples of dogs. Anyways, and so what does a child do? What they do is add some of the new information about that Saint Bernard into the schema they built about the poodle. and then they put that category one in the same. So they assimilate new information into existing information. That's one way we build knowledge, okay? The second way we do it is when something almost completely new comes along. So here we have our representation of a dog. In our basic scheme of a dog, it barks, it has ears, 4 legs, a tail, those kind of basic structures. But then comes along a cat, okay? Well, a cat has 2 ears, 4 legs, it's furry, it has a tail. And so the child initially will try to assimilate the two. But then the child will notice, well, that one has more pointy ears. The ears rotate a lot more. He does a lot more with his tail, and he meows, he doesn't bark. The dog is more social, the cat is more aloof. And they start making these differentiations, and they realize that they can't assimilate all of the qualities of a cat into their schema of a dog. And so they accommodate, they create a new category, okay? That's the process of assimilation and accommodation. And as we will see, we'll go through these developmental phases this coming Thursday. We'll begin with assimilating and accommodating our sensory experience with our motor experience. So the ability to look at a bottle in space, reach out, grab that bottle, and extend it to our mouth. So that's going to be our first assimilation and accommodation phase. And the next phase is when we can hold information in our mind. So we can give that object a symbol. And this is where we're going to start talking about things like language and how we give things symbolic meaning through language. And then in the next phase, because of the overwhelming amount of information, we're going to start categorizing objects so that we can deal with large amounts of information in very compact ways. And what this requires us is not to only hold the information in our brain, but now we have to be able to mentally manipulate that information. And so we'll talk about some tasks about mental manipulation. And then in the last phase, which is called formal operations, is when we start to think more abstractly and logically. And so starting this coming Thursday, we'll take each of these stages and we'll break them apart and we'll critique them. And just like Freud's, we will have some criticisms about them. We'll have some updates to this model so that we have an understanding of cognitive development once we're done with this, this conversation. So what I'm going to do for right now